Hi, my name is Lamarck Russell, and I'm here to do another video. I've done a few of these over the past few months that focus on the 2016 elections and the primaries and the conventions. Well, those are now over, and now we move to the general election and how that works. Okay, so before I get into it, first a few disclaimers. I'm not a legal expert or am I a constitutional scholar. I'm just someone who's done the research and knows how the system works, and I've done my best to fact check everything I'm about to tell you. Okay, if I've said something wrong, I welcome discussion and input, and I'll correct it. Well, now that that's said, I should also say that this video will be kind of long. It will be between 20 and 30 minutes long. However, you can stop after I give the short explanation to how the general election works. Okay, and I'm going to get into that in a second. So as I said, we now have our major party nominees. Okay, Hillary Rodham Clinton is the Democratic nominee for president. Donald J. Trump is the Republican nominee for president. Libertarian Gary Johnson, he's the former governor of New Mexico. He is the Libertarian candidate for president. And Jill Stein, who's a physician, is the Green Party candidate for president. Okay, I feel like I have to mention those two. Okay, since they're, they show up in some of the polls. But anyway, we now move on to the general election. And the general election has different rules. Okay, different rules from the primaries. So with that being said, you can forget about the delegates, you can forget about caucuses and conventions. Those are over. Okay, I'm going to explain the real way presidents get elected. But first, for those that don't have the time to watch this entire video, I'm going to offer a very simple explanation. Okay, this explanation is going to be so simple you can go and explain it to your 6-year-old child. And it'll only take a few minutes, okay? And after the simple explanation, for those of you who are interested, continue to watch the video where I'm going to get a lot more detailed into how the process works if you want to be more informed on election day. Okay? So, the longer you watch the video, the more informed you'll get if you're paying attention. Now, let's get into it. So, you may think that on election day, which is on November 8th, 2016, people will go and place a vote for president, and the candidate that wins the most votes wins the presidency. That's not necessarily how it works. Okay, that's false. Now, this is the way that it actually works. So here's a map of the U.S. 50 states. Okay, this is the 50 U.S. states. All right. Now, as you can see, each state has a point value assigned to it. Okay. Now, though it might not be clear, there's also a point value of 3 assigned to Washington, D.C. Okay, now that's because Washington, D.C. is not inside any of the states. Okay, it's a little city, it's a district on its own. It's called that's what D.C. stands for, District of Columbia. Okay, so the way it works is that the people in each of those 50 states and Washington, D.C., they go and they place a vote. And whichever candidate gets the most votes in a certain state wins the points from that state. For example, let's say in the state of Colorado, Hillary Clinton gets 1.2 million votes and Donald Trump gets 1 million votes. That would mean that Hillary Clinton will win all 9 points from Colorado because she won the most votes there. Let's look at another example. Let's say that in Texas, Donald Trump gets 3.5 million votes and Hillary Clinton gets 2.7 million votes and Gary Johnson gets 1 million votes. That would mean that Donald Trump wins all of Texas at 38 points, even though it's less than a majority, which is less than 50%. Because the way it works is that you need to win the most votes to win all of that state's points. Now, keep in mind, though, that the rules are slightly different for the states of Maine and Nebraska. They have different rules where they could split their points. Okay? Now, the reason that the point values are different for each state is because of the state's population. The larger the amount of people living in a certain state, the higher the point value for that state. Okay? Now, when you add all the points up together, there's a total of 538 points to be distributed. So whichever candidate wins the majority of those points, they become the next president. Now, because they have to win the majority, that means that the candidate has to win at least 270 points, because half of 538 is 269. That's half. To get to the majority means you have to get one more than that, which is 270. Okay? Now, here are the election results from the year 2012. Traditionally, states that votes Democratic is colored blue, and the states that the Republican candidate wins are colored red. So in 2012, Obama won 332 points to Mitt Romney's 206 points. Okay? So it's like a game. And it will all go down Tuesday, November 8th, 2016. The United States is like a game board, and we, the voters, are the people that get played. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me use a more politically correct analogy. We, the voters, play a pivotal role in deciding which candidate wins the points from the state that we live in. Okay? That's how it works. And that's the gist of it. That is the simple explanation. You can go back and explain to your young children. Okay? It's that simple. So if you want more details, please continue to watch this video while I will explain what those points are actually called, why the system is set up the way it is, how often those points are reassigned, and what a battleground state is. Okay? And I'll also explain a little more about how Nebraska and Maine distribute their points, and I'll talk about the fairness of it all. Okay? So, first off, those points are called electoral votes. That's what we call them. We don't call them points, we call them electoral votes. Now, it's important that we distinguish the differences. Okay? The votes that you and I and the rest of the more than the 100 million voters will cast on election day are called popular votes. Okay, because they come from the general population. Again, the points won by the various states are called electoral votes. We call them electoral votes because those are votes placed by a special group of people called electors. Okay, now these electors are referred to collectively as the Electoral College, but we'll talk about that later. So another way to think about the way it works is that each state places a vote for president. But the strength of each vote depends on the population of that state. And the person that state votes for depends on the results of the popular vote in that state. Okay? So because we have a system that's like this, that gives rise to a certain kind of state called a battleground state. So, what are battleground states? What are swing states? Here's an example of an electoral map. Okay? Notice how most of the states are already shaded blue or red. Okay? The blue states are the states that have voted reliably for the Democratic candidate in the past few election cycles. Okay? The ones that are shaded red are states that have voted reliably for the Republican candidate in the past few election cycles. These are where the terms red state and blue state come from. Okay? Usually, presidential candidates do not have to spend much money in these states because most of the people in them are already sold on one party or another. Okay? They're already sold. Don't even have to spend too much time and money there. Now, the swing states are the ones in purple. These are the states that tend to switch back and forth in their various election cycles depending on the candidates. Okay? Now, these states are the states that candidates spend the most time and money in because, given the reliability of the red and blue states, the swing states will decide the outcome of the election. So, here's another example of an electoral map. Okay, This is an example of who will win, of what would happen if the election were held today. Now, the map that I put up before was an example of past election cycles, the trends from past election cycles. This is what's a prediction of what's going to happen this year based off the polling of the various states by different organizations. Okay, so this is where we're looking like right now. Okay, as usual, blue for Democrats, red for Republicans. The states that are in yellow are the states where the polling indicates that the race is very, very close, too close to call. So we can't say one way or another who will win those states. Some of the polls give Clinton a slight lead, some give Trump a slight lead, and those are within the margin of error, so it could be tied. So these states are called battleground states. Okay, now I should note that many battleground states tend to be swing states as well, so you'll hear these terms used interchangeably often in the media. Okay, now sometimes states that are reliably red or blue can become battleground states. For example, in 2008, Virginia was not a swing state. Okay, it was a red state, but it became competitive, which made it a battleground state. Okay, now Obama won Virginia in 2008, the first time a Democrat won that state in a presidential election in 40 years at the time. And he won it again in 2012. So it seemed like Virginia may be turning blue. Now in 2008, Obama also won the red state at the time of North Carolina, but he lost the state in 2012, which makes North Carolina a swing state now. So you will see the candidates spend a lot of time in these battleground states as they hunt for electoral votes. So that makes this a very convoluted system. And why do we have such a convoluted system? That answer is because of the United States Constitution, which is the highest legal document in the country. And it lays out how presidential elections are handled. It specifies how the legislative branch, which is Congress, that is the body that makes the laws for our country. They vote on laws, and if they pass through Congress, they get sent to the president's desk for his approval or veto, which is denial. Okay? Now, each U.S. state, let me say this again. Congress has two houses, okay? You have the upper chamber, which is the United States Senate. And you have the lower chamber, which is the United States House of Representatives, okay? Each state gets 2 senators to represent their state in the United States Senate, okay? They also get a certain number of representatives to represent their state in the United States House of Representatives, okay? Not really sure what I said at first, but I think what I meant to say was that each state gets 2 senators to represent their state in the Senate, and each state gets a certain number of representatives to represent their state in the U.S. House of Representatives, okay? Now, the number of representatives that each state gets is dependent upon each state's population. The Constitution calls for a census, which is a count, to be conducted every 10 years to determine what this number should be. Okay? So, again, the census is a count of the entire U.S. population. Okay? And they do this count every 10 years to determine how many representatives in the House of Representatives that each state gets. The last time a census was conducted was in 2010, and the next one will be conducted in 2020. The new numbers are calculated after each census, and they go into effect 3 years after the census was conducted. Okay? So, for example, the 2012, the new Congress that took effect in January of 2013 was based off the 2010 census. Okay? Now, there are currently 100 U.S. senators, 2 from each state, sounds 50 is 100, and 435 representatives in the U.S. House of Representatives. All right. Now, the makeup of Congress is important because the Constitution says that to elect a president and a vice president, each state must appoint electors, these people that actually vote for president. They must appoint these people, and the amount of electors that each state appoints is equal to every member of Congress that that state gets. For example, Illinois, which is my home state, has 2 senators. Okay? Now, just like every other state has. Now, according to the 2010 census, Illinois is entitled to 18 representatives in the U.S. House. Thus, Illinois has 20 members of Congress, 18 representatives plus 2 senators. So, Illinois must appoint 20 electors to place a vote for president. This is why Illinois has 20 electoral votes. Okay? Now, again, these numbers change every 10 years. Okay? For example, Illinois used to have 22 electoral votes, but, then it went down to 21, and now we have 20. Okay? Now, the Constitution gives each state's legislature the power to determine the method for which these electors are chosen. All right, so your state legislature, which means that the people who make the laws for your state, to make the state laws for your state, has the power to determine how these electors are chosen. So with the exception of Nebraska and Maine, all U.S. states use the results of the popular vote to determine who the electors should be. Okay? So what this means is that in reality, we are not actually voting for president. We are voting for the electors who have pledged their support for the person we're voting for. Okay? So if your chosen candidate wins the popular vote in your state, that candidate's chosen electors will go on to formally place their vote for president, presumably for the person who they support, who they said they'll support. Now, there are 100 senators and 435 members of the House of Representatives. So there are 535 members of Congress, as I alluded to previously. Now, before the passage of the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution, residents in the city of Washington, D.C. could not place a vote for president since by constitutional law, the nation's capital, which is Washington, D.C., cannot reside in any U.S. state. Okay? The 23rd Amendment granted Washington, D.C. a number of electors that is equal to the state with the smallest amount of electors. Okay? Currently, that number is 3. So, we have 535 electors from the 50 states and 3 from Washington, D.C. That gives us our total of 538 total electors. Okay? Now, you should note that U.S. citizens in the American territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, and American Samoa still cannot vote in presidential elections since they are not states, technically. Okay? Now, you should also note that even though the 23rd Amendment does not give Washington, D.C. residents the right to vote in presidential elections, they still, just like other U.S. territories, do not have a voting representation in the U.S. Congress. That means that those bills that Congress votes on, none of those representatives will be from Washington, D.C. or the other territories that I mentioned because they're not states. So, what happens if an elector places a vote for a candidate other than who they said they pledged their support for? Okay, now, believe it or not, this has happened in the past. Okay, it's happened quite a few times in the past. However, I should note that, first of all, these people are called faithless electors. Okay, if you go and you formally place your vote to a person other than who you've pledged for, that makes you a faithless elector. Okay, but I should note that at no point in history, at least up to now, at no point in history has a faithless elector changed the outcome of a presidential election. Though that possibility does exist. It does exist. And it is the reason why there is a movement to rid the United States of the Electoral College completely. Okay? About half the U.S. states, I think close to 30, more than half the U.S. states, they have laws in place that punish faithless electors. And I think in Minnesota, a faithless elector's vote is voided and not even counted. Okay? So Nebraska and Maine decides their electoral votes by popular vote of each congressional district. So, okay, so let's get into how that works, okay? First of all, a congressional district is an area within each state that is representative by a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Okay, now the senators from each state, they represent the whole state in the U.S. Senate. The members of the House of Representatives, they represent their respective congressional districts. For example, in Nebraska, according to the results of the 2010 census, they are entitled to 3 representatives in the U.S. House. Thus, they have 3 congressional districts that is represented by those members. So, in Nebraska, a candidate wins 1 electoral vote for each congressional district they win, for which they win a popular vote. Okay? Now remember, Nebraska has 5 electoral votes because of 3 representatives plus 2 senators. So the winner of those extra 2 electoral votes goes to the winner of the statewide popular vote. So I understand how that can be a little confusing, so let me give you an example. Alright, so let's look at this example. Let's say these are the results in Nebraska. As you can see, Clinton wins 1 district, Trump wins the other 2. So that means that Trump wins the statewide popular vote when you add them up. So because Clinton won 1 congressional district, she gets that 1 electoral vote, and Trump won 2, and he won the popular vote for the whole state, so he gets the other 2, which is a total of 4 for Trump. Okay, here's another example. Let's look at another example. In this example, Clinton wins 2 districts and Trump wins 1. Okay, but as you can see, because Clinton won those 2 districts in a very, very close matchup, and Trump won the other one big time, he still wins a statewide popular vote. So that means that Clinton gets 2 electoral votes from the 2 districts she won. Trump gets the 1 vote for the district he won, plus the other 2 for the winning the statewide popular vote. So he gets 3, she gets 2. The state of Maine uses the same system, okay, but they only have 2 congressional districts allotted to them. So that's how presidential election works, people. That's how they work. Is it fair? Well, it depends on who you ask. Some opponents of this system want to do away with the whole electoral college system in the first place and replace it with a simple popular vote count to make it easier on everybody. Okay? Now, I should note that there have been 4 times in history where the winner of the national popular vote did not win the election. Okay? The most recent time was the election of the year 2000, when then Vice President Al Gore won the popular vote by a slim margin, but he still won it. But the then Texas Governor George W. Bush won the majority of the electoral votes. The difference was about 500 votes in the state of Florida. Okay, Bush won the state of Florida, so he won those electoral votes, but 500 votes in that state separated him from Al Gore. Now, as you would normally do when you have a race where millions of votes are cast and the difference is only a few hundred votes, multiple recounts were called for. Okay, and lawsuits were placed, and the case went to the courts, and the case ended up being decided by the United States Supreme Court, and they decided in favor of George W. Bush. Now, this was a decision that Al Gore accepted to avoid a constitutional crisis. So, for those of you who don't know, a constitutional crisis is a scenario that happens that the Constitution did not account for. Okay? Now, gladly, up to this point, we have had politicians who have been able to put their egos aside and, for the greater good of the country to avoid such crises. Okay? You don't want to have a situation where we don't know who the president is legally, and there's chaos. Okay? So, another thing that fuel opponents of the Electoral College is the fact that it is possible where you can get a slim minority of the popular vote, something like in the low 20s, in the low 20% range, and you can still win a majority of the Electoral College in a two-way race. That is possible. You can win a majority of Electoral College votes with a very, very small minority of the popular vote. Okay? And another problem is that the Constitution does state that if no candidate wins the majority of the Electoral College votes, then the presidential election is decided by Congress. The House of Representatives place a vote for president, and the vice president is decided by the United States Senate. So it's possible you can have one where the vice president and the president are not even members of the same party. Now, this hasn't happened since the 1800s. Okay, I think 1824 was the last time this has happened, but the possibility still exists that Congress can constitutionally supplant the will of the people in a presidential election. Now, proponents of the Electoral College, people who want it to stay in place, they argue that it gives a stronger voice to those people who live in smaller states. Now, this is true. Individually, collectively, voters in larger populated states have a stronger voting power than those voters who live in the smaller populated states. However, individually, the voters in the smaller populated states have a stronger voting power than the individual in the larger populated states. Okay? Now, this is because of the way that Congress does the calculations and allocates the members of the House of Representatives. Ultimately, this falls in line with what the framers of the Constitution intended. The people who wrote the Constitution were terrified of the possibility that there could be what they call the tyranny of the majority. Okay, that is that the people who live in the larger populated areas basically decide what goes with regards to the whole country. They decide the governing laws and they decide the outcome of elections, regardless of what the people in a small state want. Okay, the framers were terrified of this possibility, which is why they put systems like these in place. Okay, I think the goal is to get to be governed by the majority with the consent of the minority, if you will. Okay, so the argument here is that this keeps this system empowers the minority. Okay, so in my view, whether the Electoral College stays or goes, I believe that we need to change the fact that Congress can decide the election if the candidate fails to get the majority. That has to go, because right now Congress is unpopular, and it has been unpopular for a very, very long time. And given the huge unpopularity of Congress, if you put something as important as the presidential election in their hands, and that goes against the will of the people, that could cause a major uproar. I'm talking chaos. But why? Okay, which is probably why it hasn't happened in 192 years, and I God hope it doesn't happen again. Okay, so that's it. That's this video, people. That's about 30 minutes. I've done a lot of talking. So I'm gonna end it here. My next video will probably be whether or not this spoiler thing is true. The idea of a spoiler candidate in an election. When they say a vote for this person is actually a vote for this other person, yada, yada, yada. All right, we're going to talk about that next time. Okay? So, until now, I hope this video has been informative. I hope you learned a lot. I hope it's helped you understand the process a little bit better. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Okay? Thank you for listening.